Okay, thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm Laura Dormer, and I'm the editor of The Evidence Base. I'm pleased to be introducing our webinar today on fit-for-purpose matchmaking, a data selection and real-world evidence approach for both regulatory and health technology assessment audiences from Genesis Research Group, a global research organisation specialising in RWE, HEOR, market access and pricing. Now, before I introduce today's speakers, there's just some quick notes on how today's webinar will work. So following this quick intro, we will hear from our two speakers with their presentation, and we will also have a few polls for our audience to get involved in as we go along. And then after the presentation section, we will have time for Q&A. So please feel free to add your questions while the speakers are talking. You can use the chat section that you can see on your screens and add your questions there, and we will do our best to address as many as possible of those at the end. So moving on to introductions, I'll take you to the next slide. So today I'm very pleased to be joined by two speakers who are going to be sharing their expertise with us on this topic. So first of all, I would like to introduce Allie Sosinsky, Director, Pharmacovigilance and Safety at Genesis Research Group. Allie is a pharmacoepidemiologist with over 12 years of experience leading a variety of regulatory-focused study types, including label expansion, external comparator arm, and post-authorization safety studies. So welcome to Allie. And our second speaker is Professor Carole Longson, who is an independent senior advisor on HTAs and market access. And Carole is a respected leader in HTA, having pioneered the development of NICE's health technology evaluation programs, and is now an independent advisor. So welcome to you both. And I will now hand over to Allie, who is going to run us through today's learning objectives.
Thank you, Laura, for the introduction, and to those attending for the opportunity to speak to you about ECAs and fit-for-purpose data assessments. ECAs are a massive topic to cover, and given the time available, we've chosen to focus on real-world data considerations for early ECA planning. We have three learning objectives for today, and these include appreciate challenges and opportunities related to meeting diverse regulatory and health technology assessment, real-world evidence, needs, and expectations. Second, understand how to systematically evaluate real-world data sources to meet different regulatory, HTA, and payer expectations for various uses, such as market authorization, pharmacovigilance, and coverage and reimbursement. And then third, lastly, learn how to design real-world evidence studies to meet regulatory and HTA needs with relevant evidence synthesis, stakeholder insights, and other means. I'll pass it back to Laura at this point to take the first poll of the audience.
Great, thank you, Allie. So before we start our presentation, we have our first polling question for our audience. So please give us your opinions on the question of how important is having a systematic data source evaluation process for your RWE work? So please rate this from your own point of view from 0, not important at all, through to 10, most important. So where you would rank that. And we'll give that about a minute or so for people to respond. There are quite a few answer options for this poll, so you may need to scroll down on your screen, and at the bottom you will find the vote button. So if you hit that button, you can share that with us. So hopefully people are starting to complete that. Yeah, I can see answers starting to come in. Nothing below a 5 so far, as far as I can see. Just give that a few more seconds. And yeah, we seem to have quite a cluster towards the top end of those answers. So quite a few 8s, 8s, 9s, and 10s. Perfect. So thank you very much. Okay, so I will take us back to our slides. Okay, so thank you for doing that for us. I will now move over off stage for a little while and hand you over, I think, to Allie, first of all, who's going to start the presentation. So Allie, over to you.
Great. Thanks to the audience for your participation in the first poll. Great to see that there's already a lot of understanding on the importance of a systematic data evaluation. And I suppose it makes sense that if you feel that way, you've signed up to attend this webinar. So by way of background, there's a long-standing history of what we currently call real-world data and real-world evidence in the regulatory space to monitor and evaluate the safety of approved drugs in the post-authorization setting. There's also great enthusiasm and momentum to increase the utility of RWE to support regulatory approvals. Within the field, there have been exciting use cases where natural history studies, comparative effectiveness studies, and external control arms have supported or been the basis of regulatory decision-making for new drug approvals or expanded indications. Regulatory bodies have provided a number of guidance documents and frameworks to communicate their positions on the appropriateness and quality of RWE needed to support decision-making. As a few examples, from the EMA, there's their data quality framework, which I'll return to a bit later in the presentation. There's also the EMA's checklist for evaluating the suitability of registries for registry-based studies, and of course, the NCEP protocol template. Last year, FDA released guidance specific to the design and conduct of ECA studies, which is a helpful guidebook and sits well in the context of their other RWE guidance documents released over the past 5 years or so. At this point, I'll pass to my colleague Carole to speak to how RWE can be used for decision-making in the HTA and payer space.
Thanks very much, Allie. And as Allie has indicated, for the in the regulatory domain, it's very similar in market access and HTA. There is a long track history of the use of real-world evidence, but things are still moving, even though we've been using it for a long time in the HTA environment. There's still a lot of movement. Perhaps we can cover some of that today. But again, case studies, use cases. If you're in a jurisdiction, if you're working in a jurisdiction that uses cost effectiveness analysis, you will know that modeling natural history absolutely often, especially in the long term, needs real world evidence. Increasingly the use of real world evidence, and we're touching on that a little bit today, external control arms, increasingly real world evidence is used for comparative effectiveness. For looking at if we're in a managed access environment, again, the use of real world evidence really important there, especially tracking perhaps performance, the expected performance of new technologies matches real world use, all of that side of things. So many, many use cases. And what's changing perhaps is the formal recognition from the HTA community, the HTA environment, that that's both useful and important in the context of a holistic health technology assessment. And there are now increasingly published frameworks and published guides for how to use real world evidence in HTA. Obviously, we'll mention NICE, but there's also CADIF. Obviously, we can't forget ISA. And now we have ICWIG, HAS also producing some form of guide or framework for how they're using real world evidence. So I wouldn't quite say there's an explosion of that, but it's certainly moving quickly. It's a moving field. What perhaps isn't changing quite as quickly is the feeling perhaps that real world evidence is a second best to a much more structured clinical trial for relative effectiveness assessment. I would say that across the HTA community, there is still a very clear preference for RCTs, and there's sometimes, I wouldn't quite say we're dragging some organisations through that realisation, but there is a lot of stickiness in the acceptance of real world evidence. And that perhaps is a distinction between the regulatory feel and the HTA feel that I'm certainly seeing at the moment. Now, given all of that context, and given definitely that the use of real-world evidence is having to happen, especially in the context where you've got new drugs that are coming through regulatory environment with a single-arm trial, you really do now need to start thinking much more systematically and perhaps much earlier for how to match both requirements through a single conceptual framework. This is what we're going to cover today. Last bullet on this, it's a fast-moving field. We all know that. What's difficult is staying up to date, and it's really necessary to keep tabs across all of the agencies on how their thinking is developing on the use of HTA in their evaluations. Thanks, Allie.
Thank you, Carole. So as alluded to at the beginning, this presentation will focus on the evaluation of real-world data sources for both regulatory and HTA audiences, and we'll do so in the context of an external control arm study. Important disclosure is that we'll speak generally to our experience conducting external control arms and not about any particular study. A critical component of RWE generation, whether it's for an external control arm or another observational study type, like a label expansion, is ensuring that you have the right data source. Fit-for-purpose data evaluation is a term used to describe the process of selecting real-world data for a particular study or set of related studies. Here there is an incredible explosion of new real-world data sources that exist and that are always popping up. And there's been an increasing focus on good research practices in the field. And with this, there's a growing expectation that studies using real-world data, particularly with the intent of influencing decision-making, need to support their choice of real-world data source through a systematic evaluation. And when considering a fit-for-purpose evaluation, there are many nuances that need to be kept in mind, including that there's variation among data source types. So as a relatively simple example, some claims data sources will include information on patients' race and ethnicity, while other claims data sources don't contain that information. And also, just as a general principle, in terms of a data source, what may be a perfect fit for a research question, that same data source may not even meet the minimum criteria for another research question at hand. There's a lot of specificity to consider in the fit-for-purpose data source assessment. So here we return to the data quality framework that I alluded to earlier. So EMA and FDA have complementary frameworks describing their expectations for data quality and selection that we've depicted on the screen. On the left, EMA takes great care to point out that data quality, which they define by 5 key components, is very much question specific. And the components that EMA uses to define data quality include extensiveness, coherence, timeliness, relevance, and reliability. Similarly, FDA in their RWE framework communicates the agency's expectations for when and under what conditions they will consider RWE for decision-making. Within their RWE framework, FDA defines fit-for-use data as data that are both reliable and relevant to the specific study. Reliable gets at whether the data represent the intended underlying medical concepts and are considered consistent and credible. And then relevance hits on whether the data represent the population of interest under study and whether the data can answer the research question given the clinical context that is of interest. Fit-for-purpose RWE is then bringing those two concepts together, and I like to think of it as alignment between the research question, the clinical context, the regulatory or decision-making context, and then the data and the methods that are being used. And so hopefully, as illustrated by that long list, we can understand that a lot of factors need to be in alignment for the chosen data source to be deemed fit for purpose. Carole, would you like to comment on this from the HTA perspective?
Yeah, sure. And really what you've said and what you covered for both the EMA and the FDA applies generally across the board in HTA, and if you look at the various frameworks that HTA bodies have produced, you might not see these words, but the themes are very similar. So fit for purpose in terms of relevance, have you matched the patient cohorts? Have you got a reliable data source? Have you got the right endpoints? All of those sorts of things absolutely apply. And so, what's helpful is there is consistency. What perhaps is a little bit difficult is because each of these frameworks doesn't say exactly the same thing in the same way. You could get caught into thinking that you have to do perhaps a lot more than you really do need to do to satisfy each jurisdiction's requirements. I think probably if you distilled it down into its component parts, it would be very similar, both between regulatory and HTA, and within the various regulatory and HTA requirements. So in a sense, it's not quite as bad as it looks.
Thanks. I think that's a really important point, not to get too caught up in the slightly different language when the underlying themes defining a fit for purpose data source are relatively consistent across the different spaces. Before diving into our use case, which we'll get to momentarily, just want to take a few minutes and ensure that we have a fundamental understanding of what an external control arm study is. And we'll start with a randomized control trial. So in a traditional RCT, participants are screened for eligibility according to stringent inclusion and exclusion criteria. And if they're deemed eligible, they're enrolled and then randomized to either a treatment or control arm. And through randomization, groups are expected to be similar, and by design, treatment is unrelated to the characteristics of the trial participants themselves. This is in contrast to a single-arm trial, where participants are still screened for eligibility. However, all of the participants that are deemed eligible are given the experimental treatment. So there's no randomization or blinding, and there's no built-in control group. An external control arm can then be used to complement a single-arm trial. And single-arm trials and ECA studies have been used to demonstrate the efficacy of experimental therapies, most commonly for oncology and rare diseases. In an ECA study, patients from an external data source that are as similar as possible to those from the trial are selected, and then statistical methods are used to balance patient characteristics and compare the outcomes of these two patient populations. As Carole stated earlier, I think more specifically to the HTA space, but in my view still holds in the regulatory space as well. Randomized controlled trials remain the gold standard for decision making, but ECAs can be thought of as a valuable tool under appropriate circumstances. And there's two key points that I want to highlight here. So the first is that strong justification for the use of a single-arm trial and corresponding ECA study is necessary for submissions to regulatory, and I'd go out on a limb and say HTA bodies as well. And I see the nod from Carole. So second key point here is selection of a fit-for-purpose data source for an ECA is also essential for acceptance of the generated evidence. And again, I believe that holds true across the regulatory and HTA space. And then getting back to sort of the ECA design, in terms of data sources that can be leveraged, historical trial data, claims, electronic health records, or registry data sources can be used to create the external control arm, provided that the data source or data sources that you select are fit for purpose. And last sort of key highlight before we get into our specific use case is that I'd say despite some really promising advances in methods, study design, statistics, you just simply can't overcome poor data quality or data that are not a good fit to your research question. And I would argue this is why getting the data source selection right from the start is just so important. So now we're going to dig into our specific use case. If you will, picture a company that is in the process of designing their single-arm phase 3 trial. They have a product that addresses a rare, debilitating disease for which there is no current authorized treatment. And at this early planning stage for this use case, we're going to try to address two main questions. The first question is, can we find a suitable fit-for-purpose data source? And we'll go under the assumption that if there is a suitable data source, they would be interested in moving forward and constructing an external control arm study. And then the second question to think about for this use case is, can we design and conduct a single ECA to address both payers and regulators? If the company is going to make the investment in moving forward with an ECA, the results of that study could be valuable to both audiences. And of course, from the company perspective, it would be most efficient to do this in one go, if that's possible. So our approach to this use case is outlined on this slide, and we'll take a bit of time to walk through it step by step. Starting with the first step, we need to be really explicit on what the research question is. A fit-for-purpose data source evaluation requires a clear understanding of the study's purpose, and I'd frame that in two parts. The first is being clear in terms of the evidence generation that's needed, and the second part is the intended end use for the ECA. And we're not trying to broadly evaluate the properties and quality of various data sources. We're really trying to hone in and understand if a particular data source is going to be fit for purpose. And to be able to do that, we need to assess the data source against the intended purpose. Once we have that clarity on the research question and the intended use, from there, we want to take the time to review prior examples of relevant real-world evidence and how it was received by the relevant regulators and payers that you anticipate potentially submitting the ECA study results to. And I view this as a really important step. It's sometimes skipped. It's often done much later in the RWE generation process. But by doing this early, you're able to assess the viability of your intended path, and it allows you to go into the data source selection with your eyes open about the types of criticisms that you may encounter, which the benefit of having that insight is that you can try to be proactive in addressing those items, either from a data source selection perspective or from a study design perspective. And I view this as a very critical piece of input that helps inform the go, no-go decision that I'll speak to a bit later on this slide. So once we have that precedent review and kind of an understanding of the landscape and how the potential ECA study may be viewed, we typically approach this by running in parallel work streams, one focused on study design and the other on data source selection. And these are done in parallel, somewhat for efficiency and because they're interconnected with one another. And I'll speak to the design components first. So these are the boxes in navy towards the bottom. So for the design focused steps, we start by drafting a high-level ECA study design. And we need to have a basic understanding of a handful of things about how the study will be run to inform the data source selection. And from my vantage point, these include the study population that will be targeted using adapted inclusion and exclusion criteria from the trial, a sense of the sample size that's required from the external control arm data source, the therapies that will define the comparator arm, a clear understanding of the primary outcome, and if there are key secondary outcomes, those as well. The length of follow-up that's needed to provide sufficient opportunity to capture the outcomes of interest. And then lastly, at this sort of high-level design, an understanding of the relevant confounders that are needed to balance the trial in ECA patients. Once these design elements are drafted, we'll complement by adding operational definitions. And these operational definitions tell us about the specific variables that we need in our candidate real-world data sources. Lastly, in our design-focused steps, we need to think about prioritizing variables. Practically speaking, we'll likely need to make trade-offs when we select one data source over another. And so taking the time to think through which variables are more critical than others before you actually get into the data source selection, I think often results in more of a sound scientific process for making those trade-offs. So at this point, let's circle back to the data selection steps that are in orange at the top. One thing I wanted to highlight is that for data selection, something that we've seen here at Genesis be successful, I'd say in the rare disease space in particular, is the inclusion of evidence synthesis methods within this fit-for-purpose assessment framework. And we would leverage evidence synthesis methods to identify a comprehensive list of possible data sources for inclusion. And once we've generated that exhaustive list of possible data sources, we can then return to our priority variables and let those guide the narrowing down of the data sources until we get to a more manageable handful. I'd say anywhere from 1 to 5 max. And then on that smaller subset, we're looking to conduct detailed feasibility assessments. And this is the point where we go in depth in terms of the variables that are included in the data source, the completeness of those variables, the methods that are used to assess key variables, as well as important logistics that impact the feasibility of an ECA study, such as data lag and pricing. So at the end of this approach, we have a well thought out process that has guided data source selection, and it's time to make an informed go, no go decision on the ECA based on the fit for purpose nature of the data source or data sources selected, and coming back to how those data sources stack up to the precedents or use cases that were reviewed at the start of this process. Often these decisions aren't so black and white, and the trade-offs that you have to consider, especially when trying to juggle regulatory and payer considerations in tandem, are quite difficult in practice. I also think it's important to speak of the go, no go decision, where ideally you do want to move forward with an ECA, but sometimes the best, most responsible decision that you can make after having done this feasibility work is actually not to move forward with an ECA study. And you think about this, if feasibility results reveal a need to modify the initial approach, maybe there is still a path forward, or the takeaway could be that an ECA is not a viable path forward. And if you can't find a fit for purpose data source that you can defend to regulators or HTA bodies, whichever stakeholders you're trying to target with these results, after you've applied a thorough and rigorous evaluation process, then this becomes part of your narrative and your justification for how you did proceed when submitting your evidence. And there are other options to consider if there isn't a real-world data source identified that's suitable. These would be things like a site-based chart review or primary data collection, but I do acknowledge that those have their challenges too. So I'll turn it over to Carole to sort of comment on the approach, and looking forward to hearing your thoughts.
Yes, so this is such an important conceptual slide, but it also picks out and highlights perhaps some of the issues that we would all face in trying to think about what fit for purpose really means. And there are probably two things I'm going to say before I drill down in a little bit more detail and concentrate on those blue boxes, the design focus steps. The first is what Allie has highlighted on it's not just scientifically good practice to be doing this. It also provides the mechanism where basically you can tell the story, you can put down the justification for why you have taken and made particular decisions, particularly if it is in a comparative effectiveness framework, because that decision making gets highly scrutinized during the assessment phase, and certainly the choice of particular routes in terms of both identifying and then using data becomes an important part in allowing an assessor and evaluator to feel comfortable that one's aiming to do the right thing, not just doing the right thing. So that's the first thing to point out. The second thing to point out in general is that, certainly from my experience, the considerations around regulatory and HTA tend to still happen in sequence. And if they happen in sequence, particularly in this really complex environment of using real-world evidence, you actually lose the opportunity of being able to be efficient in the way that you are both identifying and then analysing your data. And so it becomes incredibly important to have, in a sense, both internal decision makers round the table at the same time when you're thinking about these sorts of things. So both the HTA, market access, whatever you call them, inside companies, and the regulatory clinical development teams, because the trade-offs that you would want to make and the importance of different issues from both the regulatory and the HTA environment have a massive bearing on the prioritization process of the variables once you've gone through the design phases, and also whether or not you've got a go or no go decision overall. So it's really, my take-home message for the sort of general ones is it's really important to try to build an internal decision-making framework that joins the two things together and doesn't have them going on in sequence. So again, just touching maybe on the first two of the design focus steps. And again, whilst we have a similar framework in the HTA payer environment, whilst we have very similar domains in the HTA payer environment, study population, sample size, comparators, being very, very clear about the research question from an HTA lens is extremely important in the specification stage, especially on the high level design, and also particularly then when you move to being able to specify what it is that you're needing to extract from that data source. So summaries, we could speak for a very, very long time on this slide, but in summary, trying to have both the HTA lens and the regulatory lens in parallel in this, in a sense, planning stage is really important. And it's really important because it modifies not only the design focus steps, but then how you move from those design focus steps into the interrogation of the data. Thanks, Allie.
Thank you. So at this point, I'll share my perspective on key considerations, again, staying focused on how the choice of data source will be viewed in sort of a regulatory perspective. And afterwards, I'll turn it back to Carole, who will complement this by speaking more specifically to HTA and payer considerations. So recent regulatory guidance has been clear that companies should be able to justify the selection or exclusion of real-world data sources. And I really like the way that Carole put this a moment ago. It's about building the story of how you approach this, what you did, what you chose not to do, and why. It's certainly easiest to put this story together if you have the the foundation of a systematic and documented process like what we've described, and the justifications that you're trying to make around data source selection and design come across best if they can stay grounded in the question-specific considerations. And in terms of level of rigor for feasibility assessments, key items for this to touch on include the availability, completeness, method and frequency of assessment, as well as validation of key variables. And then we haven't really touched on it until this point, but missing data is such an incredibly important part of choosing a fit-for-purpose data source. And so really having a detailed understanding of the degree of missing data, what the patterns of missing data are, and then what the implications of missing data are is really important. And the implications, I know I'm sounding a bit like a broken record, those also really need to be grounded in your question-specific considerations or the elements to your ACA study design. It's not general about the data source. Next point, thinking about the sort of regulatory space, is that the chosen data source and analytic methods for the study should be auditable. And I use that to say that the patient level data can be shared with the agencies, and you can see who accessed the data, when and what they did with it. Next, I'd highlight that there's a need for in-depth experience and or close collaboration with the candidate data sources. I see it as possible to do preliminary feasibility based on publicly available information. Maybe a data source has a published protocol about the types of information that they collect, when data collection began, the sample size, but I think it's safe to say always going to need detailed feasibility work and follow-up to do due diligence. And this really requires getting under the hood of the data source and taking the time to understand complexities of the data source that may be custom to your research question and preliminary study design. In terms of regulatory considerations, I'll end this portion with saying that regulators have really emphasized their desire to talk about their RWE plan, or to talk about your RWE plans. And this, includes these early planning decisions and stages, like data source selection and, high-level ECA study designs. And they're open to having these conversations early and often. And I see this dialogue as an important way to help try to de-risk the investment that you'd be making in an ECA study, and to get early insights that help give the best chance at acceptance for the evidence. I'll turn it back over to Carole. Thank you.
So now there we are. Now we're going to move into the considerations for HTAs and payers. And I would say that everything that Allie said has applied, but that's necessary but not sufficient. There are specific issues in I think I've got the wrong, no, just bear with me. There we are. There are specific issues with respect to HTA that you need to think about. I'll cover them a little bit. I've emphasized the point before in terms of the design preparation, but again, if we've moved on to the phase where perhaps an ECA has been done, and now you're thinking about how to actually use that in an HTA, probably what's happened is there's been quite a lot of regulatory use, if I can put it that way, of the data, and perhaps not much thought at that stage, because you're thinking about that regulatory submission of how best it's going to be used in HTA. It would be really useful if there was an opportunity to pull back that thinking, so that again it comes in parallel with the regulatory process, because there's a huge amount of read across that you can do from what's being done and what's being said in that regulatory environment that also applies to HTA from a conceptualization point of view, but also from a justification point of view, especially when it's being used for efficacy effectiveness evaluation. So that's the first point. The second point is, again, specific things for HTA. Length of follow-up of the data source is a really important thing for HTA. Again, especially in jurisdictions that take a lifetime horizon, particularly in jurisdictions that use cost effectiveness analysis, but more generally, HTA bodies will like to be able to see and feel comfortable that they have got a sufficient time horizon, a sufficient handle on that time horizon of relative effectiveness, that they can be confident that it's going to happen in real life clinical practice. So follow-up, really important. In addition to follow-up, it's where the data sources come from. I mean, literally where the data sources come from in terms of the country. That geographical relevancy is really important because, again, from an HTA perspective, you're looking at comparative effectiveness with respect to standard or established clinical practice in the jurisdiction that you're being evaluated in. So again, that check of geographical relevance or the transferability of the data source to another jurisdiction becomes important. I've mentioned long time horizon. The final thing perhaps to think about generally, again, we could spend quite a long time on data choice, but the final thing to think about is that whatever real-world evidence is used, and particularly if it is used from comparative effectiveness, that will undoubtedly lead to increased uncertainty about the magnitude of the effect size. As a consequence of that, not only do you have to think about justifying the use of the data source, thinking very, very hard about how you both capture and then explore the impact of that more uncertain evaluation becomes a crucial requirement in HTA, and formal uncertainty analysis becomes required in a number of jurisdictions. Final point I've made, consider any advice that you can get from the regulators and HTA are useful. Much of the advice you get from the regulatory environment can be read across into HTA if you've got an expert HTA lens applied to it. If you can get joint or parallel scientific advice between regulators and HTAs or within HTAs, that's fantastic. I know how difficult that is to do in many jurisdictions, and perhaps that's one thing, if we could all have a wish, it would be the increased availability of that scientific advice across jurisdictions. So that's sort of a general HTA lens. This, I think, Allie, is this sort of our final slide, if I recall. We've got a sort of a general theme that if it's possible to do a combination of HTA, payer and regulatory lenses, that would be really good. But it's probably going to come out that it will be very difficult to identify a single source or a single data collection that's going to meet all of the needs, either of the various research questions you'll have or the different regulatory and HTA requirements. The second thing, so you're going to have to draw broad and deep in order to do that. That means it's by no means a simple task. The second thing is, whilst the evaluation components are similar and the requirements are similar between HTA and regulators, there are some material differences that you need to pay particular attentions to. That's the reason why I sort of very often think, and companies, for example, may have already developed a registry, or they've had collaboration with clinicians or the academic community for registries for a very long time, but just perhaps relying on that registry that you already have is not necessarily going to be the answer to either the questions or the broader issues in the use of real-world evidence. So think perhaps more agnostically when you're thinking about what data source you need. And I think, again, as Allie and I have emphasized, this systematic approach, actually having a plan and mapping it out becomes not only useful for the data exercise itself, but for the overall development of your justification for your regulatory and HTA package. And here we are at the end, and I think it's another poll, is it not?
It is great. So thank you both very much. That was really fascinating to listen to. So as I said, we're going to have a Q&A session in just a moment. But first, we have a couple more polling questions for the audience. So the first one, to what degree do you think that regulators, HTAs and payers consider the fit for purposeness of the data selected to generate evidence? So A, it's fundamental to their decision making. B, it's important but a secondary consideration. Or C, they primarily care about the methods of use of the data with which they are presented. So again, that should be on your screens now. So I can see people's answers starting to come in. Okay. So it looks like at the moment quite a large percentage are saying that it's fundamental for decision making, but there are a few who say it's important but a secondary consideration, and some third option primarily care about the methods of use of the data with which they're presented. So
it'd certainly be interesting to know for those that have responded that the data source selection is a secondary consideration, what they would put as first. Maybe it's the viability of an ECA at large, and then getting into the data source selection.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so that one's finished now. So yeah, we ended up with the larger majority going with that it's fundamental to their decision making. But yeah, as you say, a few in the other sections as well. Okay, so we will then move on to our third and final poll. Just move over from that. Okay, so after considering what we've learned in this presentation, how important is having a systematic data source evaluation process for your RWE work? And again, if you could rate this on the scale of 0, not important at all, up to 10, most important. And again, you might need to scroll down on your screens to see all the options, and then click the vote button at the end. Excuse me. So, okay, those are starting to come in. Got just a couple of 7s, a handful of 8s and 9s, but so far most people going for 10, most important. Okay, we'll let that run for a few seconds. Yeah, you'll be pleased to hear, everybody, no one has gone any lower than a 6 so far. Any brave responders out there? But yeah, again, as with our write-up at the beginning, the majority of our answers are in the 8, 9s and 10s. Yeah. Perfect. Thank you very much. So that's our final poll. So again, I just wanted to thank our speakers for talking to us today. I also wanted to thank Genesis Research Group for organising this webinar today. So Genesis is a global research organisation specialising in real-world evidence, HEOR, market access and pricing. And this is a really interesting topic to bring to our audience. So thank you again for that. We're now going to move into some questions, and we've been receiving questions via the chat from the audience. So I will kick off with the first one for whoever wants to dive in and take it. So should the external control arm source be selected before the single arm trial? I don't know who wants to take that one.
I'm happy to speak to it, and then Carole, if you have anything that you want to add, please chime in. So there's different components to the single arm trial. There's the decision to proceed with a single arm trial. Then there's the time that it takes to develop the protocol for that, the time to execute on the trial, and then the readout. So when I think about the question, at least from a regulatory lens, my interpretation of their guidance is that it would be preferential to select the data source before you have any indication of what the results of the single arm trial may be. And I'll sort of, that's on the later end of the single arm trial execution, but I'll bookend it by saying that you need enough of the single arm trial design to be able to do a fit for purpose data source evaluation. So those are kind of your starting and your endpoints, and the earlier in that process you can start, the better off that you'll be.
Perfect, thank you. Carole, did
Yes,
you want
Allie,
to comment on that?
Yeah, I'm with you on this one. The as early as you can might be the way to put it, because, well, firstly, does this trial need to be single arm is the most fundamental question to ask. If the answer to that is yes, lots of reasons why that might have to happen, then as soon as you've locked the main parameters of that single arm trial, once you've got those, I think, as Allie, it'd be interesting to know what you think. I think you can go into the design phase. You can start thinking, well, okay, I now know what I've got in my single arm trial. How am I thinking now about how I'm going to use that single arm trial from the regulatory purposes, but particularly for the HTA? There will be lots and lots of issues in that single arm trial that aren't going to help you in the HTA environment. And so knowing what those are, and then checking what HTA organizations have done about those in the past, and then thinking about how you can mitigate for that through real world evidence, becomes the objective. So as early as you can, and definitely not leave it till after the trial is out and complete.
Great, thank you. Okay, so another question from our audience now, and do keep adding these to the chat, everybody. We've got a few minutes. So, do you employ target trial emulation for study design and rationale?
Happy to speak to this one.
That's one for you, Allie.
Yeah, once we have that data source selected and we're more focused on building out the design steps, that is sort of the typical approach that we do follow. I think of target trial framework and estimates framework as really the gold standards for building out a causal inference study using observational data. The idea is to think about the trial that you would have run to make causal inference and try to carry over that same sort of style of thinking to the data that you do have. And the main advantage of doing this is it sort of removes the trap of certain types of biases that you can fall into. So yeah, that is sort of a typical approach.
Thank you. Okay, another question from the audience. Are single arm trials and external control arms part of one study protocol that outlines methods for both, or are these typically different studies with separate protocols?
They're typically going to be separate protocols. I think often there's a temporal difference in when they're developed. So practically speaking, then you want to finalize the trial protocol ahead of when you would finalize the ECA protocol. They also need to be able to speak to different things. So in the trial, procedures for informed consent and protection of human subjects become incredibly important for interventional study. And then for the observational data, typically you're using secondary data where you don't have an interventional component with patients or participants, so that there's different elements to what you're going to collect. But certainly the trial protocol will be a very critical input into the ECA study protocol.
Great, thank you.
One of the things we haven't been able to, we haven't had time to touch on. I mean, there are nuances of external control arm. The use case that we've presented is where you're starting, in a sense, right from the beginning of your clinical trial, your single-arm clinical trial. But very often, and particularly in the HTA environment, what tends to happen, you might even have an you'll have an RCT. It's considered not sufficient in terms of length to be able to justify long-term benefit. And so what you're having to do is effectively construct a single-arm comparison at the end of your RCT component. And so that also becomes a really complicated thing to do, and probably even more complicated than when you're in the single arm trial phase. So there are many nuances to this concept of external control arm, and as we're seeing more and more often, we're having to think, conceptualize it actually inside what would be ordinarily an RCT framework environment. But there are other places where the framework that we've been talking about here on how to systematically think through the data, it also applies to other places. So it's not just about the use case that we've talked about. The thinking that we're explaining is not just for the use case that we have demonstrated, if I can put it that way, can be used in all sorts of other places.
Perfect. Thanks, Carole. I think we've probably got
Sorry
time
about that. A bit long-winded,
That's
but
okay.
I hope you've sort of got the gist of it.
Brilliant. So I think we've got time for just one very quick question, and I think again, Carole, it might be one for you. Does the establishment of the JCA, the Joint Clinical Assessment, affect how ECAs will be evaluated?
What a great question. And, I thought I might get one about JCAs. I think long-term, yes. Short-term, difficult to envisage, because in the short term, there are many other issues that are needing to be worked out in terms of joint clinical assessment, and how the individuals assessors that are going to contribute to the joint output view, firstly, real-world evidence to start with. Secondly, the frameworks that they have built up inside the JCA, the methodological guides for the approach to the assessment of real-world evidence, at the moment is pointing towards not looking very favorably on real-world evidence as the evidence base for comparative effectiveness. So I think at the moment, when we move into live JCAs, we will see a lot of turbulence around the use of real-world evidence in JCAs. I think it will have to and will need to move really quickly into adopting as a JCA a framework that can be applied across all of the jurisdictions that are contributing to it. So long response to a short question. I think it's going to be quite a long time before we see systematic and very straightforward evaluations of joint ECAs inside that JCA environment.
Brilliant. Thank you, Carole. And I think we're just sort of running over time here, so I think we'll have to call the Q&A to an end there. But thank you ever so much, everyone, for all of your questions, and for all the ones that we haven't been able to cover. We will aim to provide a response. So please keep an eye out for further emails from Genesis Research Group for that. So it just remains really for me to say thank you both again for speaking with us today, for answering all those questions from our audience. So many great questions, so thank you to the audience for those. And just to let everybody know as well that the webinar will be available shortly on demand via the evidence base, and attendees will also receive an email with a link to access that. So that will be with you shortly also. So thank you again to our speakers, and thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you, Laura. Thanks to everyone in the audience.